So good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Sheldon. I was invited by Nick to give a presentation today. Hopefully, I'm assuming at this point anyway, everybody can hear me. Normally when I do these, they're in person, so a little bit more kind of reactive rather than looking at a computer screen. Nick had some indication as to what he wanted me to present on tonight, but I was looking at the subject matter and I thought, you know, I've got 2.5 hours to excite all of you and have a test at the end and go through all sorts of different material. And I thought, what could I actually do to bore you to tears for 2.5 hours? So I didn't want to actually do this presentation for personal protective material because I think it's something that we will unfortunately be dealing with for quite some time. So I wanted to actually see Nick's reaction if I put up something completely unrelated to what we're going to talk about actually tonight. What we're really going to talk about, though, is crime scene management and evidence preservation. It's something that comes up obviously in my day-to-day life. Just a little bit of a background about myself. I'm the sergeant in charge of the forensic services for Vic PD. And I've been 28 years with Vic PD now, a couple of years in the military before that. And most of my career actually has been dealing with major crime in one manner or another, either with forensic ident as a frontline ident officer. I've also did 5 years service with our homicide unit. 10 years of my career was spent as a frontline ident member. And then for the last approximately 3 years, I took over the forensic services. Now for us in Vic PD, forensics covers 2 different units. One's the forensic ident services. That's actually the crime scene unit. So we attend all manner of criminal offenses, from property offenses right through to homicides. The other half of my unit is the tech crimes unit. So if you think about any sort of digital evidence, and that's an area that has up and coming. It's an area that we have right now 3 forensic officers that work with digital evidence. It's growing massively in leaps and bounds, as you can imagine, and it's something that just the sky's the limit on digital evidence. But where we're going to focus tonight is on the crime scene side of it. For my staff in the ident side, they're mainly trained as frontline evidence collection and documentation officers. They're called to basically any type of crime scene in Greater Victoria. We do generally only work in Victoria and Esquimalt, but we also do attend other crime scenes outside of the area if it's an offense that deals or being investigated by our officers. And like I said, that's where we're going to spend a little bit more of our time tonight. One of the things, I do a lot of these presentations for different public groups. I do them for schools as well as community college and university. And one of the warnings that I give typically when I do a presentation is that I make a lot of effort to make sure that there is no offense given to the victims, the survivors, or family members of any of the criminal offenses that I'm dealing with. Quite the opposite, actually. I try to use the examples that I do give in a respectful manner. And also all of the images or anything that I deal with, I only generally can pick from offenses that have actually gone through the court process. So in effect, they become public when I enter them in a court. So that's just a sort of a general warning before we go through. I don't pick horrific images. I don't find it necessary. It takes away from sort of the lesson that I'm trying to give usually. What is crime scene management in my terms? It's any of the actions that we take to preserve and document. We do a lot of activity at the crime scene. We spend the bulk of our time processing a crime scene from the start to what starts out for us usually as a dynamic scene. When we go to the initial scenes of crime, often they're chaotic. They can obviously involve loss of life, witnesses, offenders, and each of the parties that are involved in it really has a different sort of goal in mind. It may be to evade us, it may be to mislead us, It may simply to be honest and open and to get assistance, but we never know right at the front end which it's going to be. So they're often quite a wide range of behaviors that we see, quite a wide range of scenes that we see, and a lot of the time, most of the time actually, we can't take everything at face value. The initial call for service we're taught right away, I'm sure it's within any service for first responders, is our call for service really doesn't necessarily match reality. What we're getting called for could end up being a simple noise complaint, like I said. It could go right through to the actual investigation becomes a homicide. What's thought to be a break and enter could be something as simple as an animal on a roof. The call for service is only a starting point for us. So it's really something that we take with a grain of salt, and it's something that we look at as a starting point only. A couple of background sort of guidelines as to when we go through to a scene. Like any first responder, if the scene initially exists with a survivable injured person, that preservation of life is surmounting everything. If our frontline officers go to a scene and they see something that gives rise to belief that another victim could be inside, we'll actually make entry without warrant and we'll search for living people. We realize that that's going to likely risk evidence loss, but everything that we're dealing with is sort of a triangle. So that at the very top of it is potentially survivable injured party persons. If that means we have to escort in other agencies and other first responders, we try. Our training leads us to believe that minimizing the first responders may be necessary, but still escorting in a logical manner in to actually save lives. That's what we're all here for. So that's really the penultimate. It's the top of our list as to what we're going to look at. This came up a couple of months ago. Actually, I was doing a very similar lecture with first responders in another field, and we talked about preservation of life and how we're taught for the policing side what the sort of the triangle of life for them. And we put the living victims, witnesses, or injured person ahead of ourselves. Second to that is preserving the life of ourselves and other officers. And then immediately following that is preserving the life of an offender or an accused person. Even if we've had to use force, we still will make all attempts possible to save the life of an injured person, even when we've caused the injury. So we had a little bit of a lively discussion with, like I said, other first responders as to if that matches what their training and their beliefs are. But that is definitely the way that the police are taught, is that priority of life is always the victims and witnesses, and then carrying through to us. So we look at it as, we know we're putting ourselves at risk. That's an acceptable risk, and all of our actions are based on that. One more guideline that we have to really talk about is exigent circumstances. For us going into a static scene, if everything is static and everything is over and done with, then we have to look at the scene itself, and if we're going to look for a warrant. Is there a privacy right that we have to actually get a warrant? If there's an exigent circumstance that says we have to go in and search without warrant, that's defensible under law. So we still will go in, we still will search any place that normally we would require a warrant. We'll go in and do a search. The second that that search is over, failing finding any further victims, that's when we stop. We don't conduct any further search for evidence. We exit and we secure the scene. At that point, we then, internally anyway, have our arguments amongst the investigators as to the need for a warrant. Typically, that argument, and I will call it an argument for it, is often done by my officers. So we get to a scene, one of our first questions is, how am I going inside there without a warrant? So our default position is towards a warrant, and then we have to have a discussion as to whether a warrant exists for us to enter or not. It's something that we will ultimately have to argue in court. So us having the argument up front and having a discussion as to a warrant being required is better done now when everything is under control, rather than done later defending why we didn't get a warrant. So what do we do? There's a bunch of different ways that we could sort of discuss how we break down the management of a scene and how do we assess the scene. But what I've tried to identify are the methodical steps that we take. And this, again, this is not a patrol-based discussion. This is from a forensic the forensic side. And looking at my officers who typically get called out, it could be a matter of an hour later, it could be hours later when more of an investigation is required at the scene. Each actual call out that we deal with when we're called to a scene is different. Each is unique, and each one takes that assessment to say, how do I identify the scene? What do I have to do? And this is typically done by patrol, is how do I secure it? What resources do I need? And who can I call on to help me do the rest of the plan for it, which is creating a plan, evaluating, and then carrying out all of the remaining documentation and collection of evidence. One of the things that really, I think at my house anyway, makes it that I'm not allowed to watch any of the crime scene TV shows is my family is sick of me yelling at the TV when everyone goes walking straight into a deceased person. And everyone is the detectives, the crime scene officers, usually a chief of police or somebody else, and everybody walks straight into where the body is. And apart from the preservation of life issue, that's not done. So that whole issue of going directly into what a primary scene is, into the innermost area, and then checking that, checking a person or checking the body, that's not done except for the preservation of life side of things. What we can go into now is a little bit more detail on how each of these steps takes place and what we do during each of the steps. Identification of the scene, and this is something that I have to teach to our junior patrol supervisors quite often and remind them. We tell them as a basic rule, go big or go home. We can often collapse a scene. We can move in closer and closer if the outlying areas are not really relevant. But actually capturing the outside areas where you end up finding evidence is a real problem. If we go inside, and this was a recent call out, obviously in Centennial Square, a lot of the evidence was in the innermost area in the photograph. So that's where the scene was captured. Unfortunately, there was a fair amount of evidence outside of our crime scene as well. And we're looking at this picture roughly west. A fair amount of my work, actually, after the initial scene attendance, was outside of the area taped off, and it was following blood trails. So that becomes a huge issue for us. If we collapse into an inner scene too quick, we risk losing evidence. We risk missing something entirely. It could be a departure scene, it could be a second bleeder, or something else that we're looking at. And we could lose an actual evidence trail. We could lose a key amount of evidence that's deposited as the person flees. One of our biggest lessons that we give to our supervisors is we really only do get one attempt at this. If we've given up an area, it's almost, not quite, but almost impossible to gain that area back again. When I say that most of the outermost area in this particular incident was more of value, if you're looking at the lower right photograph, this is now in the area that was west of the inner portion of the scene. And this is where, in this particular incident anyway, there was a series of blood droplets that were leading quite a ways away from where the incident of violence took place in Centennial Square. Most of the time when we're looking at a blood trail, we often find the victim still in the place. The blood trail where the primary incident took place is quite readily identifiable. We look for projected blood, we look for weapons, we look for a number of things in that inner scene. But on the outside, towards the edges of the scene, what we're looking for is a secondary bleeder, or somebody could have been cut while they were wielding a knife or an edged weapon. And as they flee, they're running away with more contaminant, more blood leaving the area. That's actually usually of more value than the inner area, because it could help us identify the person responsible. In this one, you're looking at a crime scene that probably should have been at least a half block larger in all directions. We do balance that off with the public safety aspect. We also have to weigh in that today's situation, we've got a lot of encampments around town, and are we able to safely remove people out of the area and conduct a full investigation? So we do have to weigh a lot of different aspects for how am I going to lawfully move people out? Can I shut down residents, a business, a public space? The answer to a lot of them is yes, we can actually shut those places down, and we often do. The identification of the primary scene and us only getting one opportunity is huge for us. We come to some scenes when we're called out, and the innermost scene may be something that's obvious, it may be something that's readily identifiable. This was a homicide incident, unfortunately, on Gorge Road a number of years ago. And everything appeared to be contained in a very small area of a parking lot. In reality, most of the evidence that was gathered in this investigation was probably in the more likely about a 4-block radius. Vehicles had fled. An injured person who later succumbed to injuries had been driven away from this scene. And the innermost scene itself should have been at least about twice as large as this area. And it would have captured at least then towards the businesses, towards what most businesses have these days, which is video. And it would have captured a lot more of the activity that took place before what in this case was actually a shooting incident. What we have to instill on our investigators and our frontline officers is that all the different aspects, though, the scene security itself, how am I going to close it down? How am I going to lock down that area? How many officers? How many officers for resources do I have? Also, weather takes a huge impact, or can have a huge impact on what we're about to do. In the typical winters that we get, howling wind and a lot of rain, there may be an opportunity that I have to cover areas. I want to be very concerned, or if it's a patrol aspect of it, the officers there are very concerned about contamination. However, if all of the material that I'm ultimately going to try to collect is washed away and heading down a drain, that's doing nobody any good. So we have to do a lot of quick reactions based on weather conditions, based on lighting. I've got a lot of material and equipment that we can bring into a scene, so that the lighting aspect, we're not out in the middle of nowhere with no power supply, and we're fairly self-sufficient on lighting and collection material, so I don't need to be concerned about it when I get there or when my staff get to the scene. One of the things that I've listed also, though, is public intrusion. When downtown is busy, we're typically called out at bar closing for incidents of violence around bar closing. And more often than not, somebody will try to cut through or move through into our crime scene. It happens actually, I couldn't even guess how many times that I've had to either move people out myself or have one of the scene protection officers come over and help and remove somebody from a crime scene. And the usual response is, I'm walking through here because I always walk through here. doesn't get you a positive response from us when we're trying to do our job. And I'm not saying that you guys would do that, but we do get that from unfortunate members of the public that are intoxicated or thinking that it would be funny to walk right into the middle of the crime scene. One of the things that our frontline officers from my end are not necessarily well versed or well equipped, though, is up until the recent situation with PPE, with protective equipment, they're not equipped to change gloves always and often. We do that for evidence collection. They're not necessarily equipped or trained to collect DNA samples, to swab material. So that's why we have a call-out system that forensic officers are on duty 24/7. We maintain an on-duty call-out member. The same with our digital evidence officers. There's always an on-duty call-out member to respond to an incident 24/7. One of the situations that has to be done as well is when we deal with an inner scene where the activity initially took place, we always have to give mind to secondary scenes. This is actually what I like to give once in a while is a very positive example. Again, unfortunate situation with the loss of life, and we were investigating. The primary scene from here was probably about, I want to say 4 blocks away. And the secondary scene consisted of a zigzag pattern where an offender was known to have run through backyards, hopped over fences, and he was believed to have hopped through this area. And the patrol officers that responded really, really did an excellent job on securing what they thought was the potential for a secondary scene. And if you look at the series of photographs, this is just an example of the type of evidence documentation photographs that we take. A residential address, the side of the house, and then zeroing in on that gate that's seen in the right-hand photograph. If you look at the left photograph at the bottom, what I'm looking at actually is one contact point of blood that was transferred from the accused, who had also cut himself in while he was using an edged weapon on another person. So the secondary scene that often gets overlooked or may never actually even be found, in this case was secured really, really well. It gave critical evidence and it was captured, documented and captured. And that actually was blood from the accused who had cut himself. So one of the things that we don't know, though, is we often don't know where these secondary scenes might exist. And that's one of the reasons that we will zero in on areas. And the whole thing that I started out with go big or go home, this was screaming out that whole lesson to our officers about why that was so important, why getting in immediate information on a potential flight path of a person from a violent offense was so important, and containing all of those other secondary areas was so important in this case. Securing the perimeter. This causes us a fair amount of resource issues throughout the course of investigations. The area itself has to be maintained by uniformed personnel. The safeguarding of the scene, both for a public safety aspect, we don't know if persons may come back. We don't know if an offender may come back to a scene. We often find, or believe anyway, that offenders do, where possible, at times come back and they watch police activity. That's one of those things that's quite often talked about on an arson investigation. It does happen also in homicide investigations or in violent crime. In this particular occasion, the offender actually had fled, and he had fled from where an attack had taken place at a high school in downtown. And in the top left photograph, it's Central High School. My back is to the #1 fire hall on Yates Street. He had fled across the street prior to police arrival, of course, and he had actually stayed in the area on the periphery, on the edges of our secure line, and just had observed the comings and going of police for some time. We often will close off areas for public view as well. One of the reasons for this, like I said, is some of the images are slightly graphic and things. You can tell by volumes of blood. This was a homicide, unfortunately. We will protect the vantage point from public view as well as from the press. And we do that intentionally. Some people question why and what is our motive to hide things from the public or hide things from the press. And it's actually not to do that. It's not to hide things. It's to protect our investigation to some degree. What we're looking for often during the time when we're securing the perimeter and starting our very basic investigation, our very initial investigation, we're trying to locate key evidence that may become holdback. Something that we know, something that an offender would know, but if it's not flashed across the screen with the TV on the 6 o'clock news, the average public, any other first responders necessarily, won't know that key element of the investigation. They won't know, for instance, was this a stabbing versus a handgun that was used, the number of wounds or location of wounds. So we will preserve even visual aspects from the public, visual aspects of the investigation from the press as well. We also try to keep in mind when we're dealing with things that could be children watching or somewhere nearby. So we do try to protect the public to some degree. These days, that almost is impossible. Just everyone has a camera. People can't be prevented from filming. I wouldn't actually tell them to stop filming unless it was impeding my investigation. So somebody has the right to stand outside of our police line. They can film me. They can film other aspects of it. And I hope what they do with the images is respectful, but I have no ability to stop any of that these days, none at all. One thing that we do want to mention just here as well is one of our reasons for preventing some of these images from getting out is next of kin notification. We try to, wherever possible, conduct an in-person next of kin where there's been significant injury or loss of life. We do that in person. If it's outside of our jurisdiction, we ask another neighboring police department to do that next of kin notification. And we try to do that in advance of what could be horrific images going out on the public press and a family member learning of the loss of a loved one by the 6 o'clock news. For us, dealing with the innermost scene, a lot of the evidence right at the front end of it, or the front end of our investigation, is not really even known how it's going to relate. We don't know what's going to become key evidence. We can see in this image a number of cigarette butts, but it's a downtown area. Where are you not going to find cigarette butts? We look at the lower image on the left, and we can see what's starting to be what appears to be a footwear impression in blood. Those key pieces for us start to give us a bit of a timeline. So you can see where it's really, really important for us to control the access. If there is no life-saving effort to be completed, there is no reason for additional personnel to be inside a scene. We actually will maintain a scene perimeter. We'll have an officer responsible for guarding that perimeter and only allowing access to persons that are designated and allowed to attend. And if that means telling a deputy chief, I just want to make sure that I get his name spelled correctly because he's going to be called to court to explain why he or she is there. That would be involved as well. We do not want to have any extra personnel inside of a scene. And you can see readily why. What contaminants are they going to bring in? What are they going to step on and remove? What items are they going to alter in some way? And it's hugely important for us to control that access. Our evidence plan. We establish when we start to look at the actions or what was the type of offense, we're going to assign, from our end anyway, a primary forensic identification officer. If it's required, we'll assess and call out a second member to assist. The primary forensic officer will maintain this right through the court, basically. He or she will be the primary officer to do all evidence collection. They'll designate all of the activity that's going to take place. And it's kind of rank irrespective. It doesn't matter if I'm the assistant or if I'm the primary on it. Whoever got called out in our system, they own that investigation from the ident side right through to the end. We're fairly controlled as to what we'll establish for collection points, for a plan as to how we're going to stockpile our equipment and where. Right to the establishment of a garbage point, so we know anything in that area is going to be deemed non-evidentiary, and we don't lose track of gloves, we don't lose track of face masks or anything else that we're using, extra swabs that are not required. Everything will go into a collection point. One of the things that you're kind of getting a sense of here is one of the key parts for us really is bloodletting scenes. Bloodletting scenes are problematic for us because we, just by nature of where it is and how it is, we're going to have to go in. The same with any other medical first responder. We're going to have to go into the innermost scene, but we have to plan on doing so rapidly if we're in the life-saving phase, but in a methodical way after that. And if you're looking at this image, where are you going to step? What is the way, what's the vantage point that you going into a scene can try to preserve evidence wherever possible? When we're looking at our entry points and exit points, typically a person that's committing an offense is trying to get out of this area as quick as possible. If they've already taken activity or taken steps to injure or end a person's life, they're going to get out of there with as much speed as possible. We're doing quite the reverse. We're going in, we're walking along the walls, we're going in sort of a roundabout route, avoiding any of the major contaminants, avoiding anywhere that we're going to collect material on our footwear, even though we're wearing quite often a Tyvek suit or footwear covers. We're going to walk through the area in a manner that's going to preserve as much evidence as possible. And if we have to go through an area that's going to contaminate a portion, we'll do so in the least damaging way possible and mentally note or record where we're moving through, what we're altering in the process of going through. This I can't stress enough. We take hundreds and hundreds of photographs at every scene. Every time that we enter into initial scenes and do that evaluation, we're either conducting a video and a photo documentation. We do default to both our digital cameras contain in their system a way to take video, but we also have other video equipment that we'll go through. Typically, though, it's the photo documentation because we can have such a high resolution image and bring in so much detail with our photographs. And we do it in a manner that starts to document an overview right through to a very detailed image close up. Anything that's had to be moved inside that scene, we have to document and explain. So one of the things that's really critical is if members, and by members I include first responders of any type, if any of the members going into a scene have had to move articles, we never instruct them to move them back to the initial location. We just want a notation to be made, a report to be made to say, I moved that and this is why I had to move that. There's so many different reasons why that could be. It could be that there's still fights ongoing. There could be weapons nearby. There could be a dangerous situation that something had to be contained and moved out of the way. All of those are really explainable, but the problem is when that information doesn't come back to us. This is kind of a key example of it. Again, it was unfortunately with my examples, they're often violent offenses. The primary officers that were dispatched to a suicide involving a firearm. When the initial officers went in, they made an assessment along with first responders for the life was over for the victim. When they got into the scene, though, one of the officers had determined that the firearm had to be made safe or rendered safe and moved out of the way. That was a decision that they made. I'm not faulting that decision, although I would not have made it safe at that point myself. There was no, in my mind, need to. But by the time the forensic officers attended, despite the firing of the pistol being, the revolver not being anywhere near where you see it, it was now resting on this side table or desk, and the fired cartridge was removed and placed beside it. The attending forensic officer, of course, looks at this and sees this and says, well, this is not a suicide. And it starts them off on a different investigative track right away. They're a different mindset. They're starting to look at this as a homicide initially. That simple act of doing some necessary action in the first responder's mind, the officer's mind at first, was not explained. And that took the investigation for a period of time, not for very long, but for a period of time on a different track. It was definite that there was a stop. This has got to be reassessed. This has got to be looked at as a homicide, when that wasn't the case at all. It was easily explainable had the officer that did those actions just explained it, made sure that that was passed to the next forensic officer that attended the scene. We find this happens a fair amount. You can imagine any life-saving efforts that go on in a confined area. All of the chairs, desks, books, whatever it may be, have to be moved out of the way. A victim may have to be removed from a soft bed to a harder surface so that the CPR can be done. All of those activities have to be done to save lives, but they need to be documented somehow. They need to be remarked on, and that needs to make its way back to the investigating officers. Processing the scene itself for us is a challenge at times. The scene itself, like this example, may be strewn about with a lot of debris. There may be evidence, there may be nothing of evidentiary value inside an area. There may be a massed amount of articles that are inside, right from a hoarding situation right through to just a very disheveled room or place in town. And it's often very difficult right away for us to determine what has taken place and what's going to be of evidence. We will often collect far more pieces of evidence or potential evidence than we ever will use. And again, it goes back to that first thing. We get one chance at this. We'd much rather collect a far larger amount of material than we'll ever actually use, or that can ever start to determine a cause of an offense. There is a manner for us to return property. We can return it lawfully back if it's of no value to us whatsoever. We can also hold off until all the testing is done or until the end of a court process. And if it's something that we don't need, we can lawfully return the material. What we can't do is go back inside necessarily weeks or months later and find something that we now figure is key evidence. We may have a photograph of it existing, but we didn't know to collect it at the time. Our secondary evaluation, when we're still inside the scene, we're going to mark all of the exhibits. We do that afterwards because we don't want to be accused of concealing something. If you look on the right-hand photograph, hopefully you can see it. The evidence placards are placed afterwards. The evidence placards wouldn't be placed immediately because we do get accused in court of concealing items. So we have to take a series of photographs to show with and without rulers, injury photographs from various angles and from various lighting conditions. But we want to do that in a manner that if we had to prove that we weren't concealing anything, we still have those photographs. We have to take a lot of images to show relationships, where an article was, how close another article was to it. And as we slowly carve our way through the different layers of evidence, we may find additional evidence underneath. Once we're at the point of starting to look for the minutiae, looking for the fine detail, that's when we'll often find something that's initially not readily visible or readily seen by any of the attending officers. In this example, the small droplet of blood that's being swabbed away from a door lock, it gives us an idea of timeline. It gives us an idea that this was done after bloodletting had occurred on one of the exit doors. But look how easy that could have been wiped out. That was an example of one where the crime scene was preserved in a very good manner. The areas that shouldn't be touched, there was no requirement to be touched. They weren't, and small areas of evidence was still preserved. But if that had been on the door handle, would that have been wiped off? Could attending officers or other first responders have simply have wiped that off just by contacting the door handle going in and out? So our final walkthrough, we've collected the evidence, we've bagged after many, many photographs. We'll do a final walkthrough. The final walkthrough is done again, usually with the senior investigators. We call them the command triangle. So there's a primary investigator. There's also a team commander that looks at all the resources. And the command triangle will want to have at least an overview, especially if you're talking about a homicide or any of the very, very serious investigations, because we want to look at one more time, one more fresh pair of eyes to have a look and see, is there anything possible that we've missed? Is there any type of investigation or exam potential that we could do by bringing in other experts or other equipment? And at this point, if the answer is no, we don't have any other tests that we could do, we've collected all the evidence, one of the evaluations that we'll end with really is, can I hold on to the scene? Now this goes back especially to a homicide investigation. If the area where a homicide took place is like, say, for example, an apartment or a dwelling house, often we will actually lock down that building or lock down that scene until after autopsy. And we'll actually hold on to it even if we've required a warrant. That warrant, unless it's end dated that we must end by a certain date, allows us to stay. And as long as we entered at the appropriate time period named in the warrant, we can retain it as long as we're still investigating. And we'll often do that right until after autopsy, because the autopsy may be something that gives us more direction on a cause of death. And it may be something that we don't know an exact cause until after autopsy. And it's something that will only tell us a type or a manner of death that we're investigating, and it'll give us something more to look for. If it's some area that we have collected all the material and we don't need to retain that scene, we'll turn it back over to the lawful owner as soon as we can, really. As much as you might not think, one of the problems that we do find, though, is who owns the building, who owns the property. With rental properties or with rental property such as either a rooming house or a hotel suite, we have to determine who do we turn the suite back over to. Who have we deprived access, who actually owns it, depending on if it's, again, like an apartment or a house or something like that. If during the course of our investigation we've caused damage, which we often do, we will actually take photographs of all of the damage that we've caused, and we may, as a city or as our department, be liable to restore that building or that dwelling. Other times it's part of our investigation and we won't assume liability for it at all. We'll turn it back over to an owner, and the city or other civil actions can take place to look at who's going to be liable for damages. But if it's an innocent victim and we've had to do damage to something to gain evidence, we'll entertain a discussion with them as to, not from my office, but from our department, as to who is liable for those damages. So it's, like I said at the start, it's kind of weird doing a Zoom presentation for me because I don't get a lot of input right now just from the audience. Hopefully you're still there. One thing, if you've got a question about an episode of CSI, I'm not allowed to answer any of those ones. Those ones start my blood pressure going up way too high. And like I said, I start yelling at the TV set. But this is kind of an overview of the steps that we take without going into how we physically bag articles or how we contact them and what tests. But I'm really open to any questions that sort of have come to your mind during the presentation. And hopefully a couple of points have been well worth discussing.
So Jonathan, I've got a whole bunch of questions for you if you want to tackle them now.
I'd love to. I'm just trying to see how the best, if I can leave the sharing, but away we go.
People are asking, can they ask you about Law and Order?
Law and Order's okay.
Okay. First question, are forensic officers all police officers or can they be civilians?
I'll answer from a Canadian perspective. In Canada, we only use sworn members as forensic officers. We're all trained sworn police officers. That's slowly changing. If we were down in the US, it's all across the board. There's a combination of civilian and sworn. Some are armed sworn police officers, other ones are civilian. We really haven't gone the civilian route yet in Canada.
Okay. Once the investigation is done, who gets to clean the scene?
That's a good question, actually, and private companies. It's really a problem, actually, and move it even further into a worse scenario, hazmat. We had a hazmat situation involving a death in town some time ago, and it's hazardous material. It's chemicals that can cause death. And it's done not by the property owner, but they have to contract to a qualified private company. We don't do that. That being said, at various times in my career, I have been unwilling to turn over a bloodletting scene to a family, just out of the human nature of it, so I've cleaned it.
Okay. For, I guess, evidence, someone's asking that Vancouver Police Department once said paper bags are better than plastic bags. Is this true? If so, what's the reason?
100%. I'll sort of split it. If it's sodden and dripping material, it may have to temporarily go in plastic just to contain it. And that's until it's contained to go into an evidence drying locker. Paper bag is permeable. So if it's something that has blood droplets on it, could be, say for example, a piece of footwear, one or two shoes. If they've got a small amount of blood on it, if you put a shoe into a plastic bag and seal it up, it'll start to be fuzzy and moldy very, very quickly. You can't dry it enough. There's so much sweat in through it. So what we'll do is everything goes into paper bags. Sealing of the paper bags typically is just by folding them over and stapling them shut. And then those paper bags go into drying lockers. It still has air that can flow through to some degree from paper, but then the drying takes place on the article itself, like a shirt with a couple of droplets of blood. It'll still dry inside that paper bag.
Okay. How do responding officers decontaminate themselves after departing a scene where there are fluids everywhere? Is there a likelihood of contaminating any subsequent scenes they go to?
Good question. Contamination's huge for us. So their decontam, we train our officers to wear gloves. Unfortunately, they also have different types of gloves. So they'll have either the regular exam gloves, or they'll have a Kevlar type of glove that's more of a protection against sharp objects. If they're wearing their Kevlar gloves, they've got a leather coating on the outside, so that can absorb material, and that's something that we don't want them in contact with material at this scene to that scene to the next scene. The way we're trained is one article, one pair of gloves. So we go through literally hundreds of gloves every time we're at a scene. Their decontamination efforts are to clean as best possible at the scene. We tell them as well to go back to the office if need be, change out of their uniform, wash. They can shower, use the shower facilities here. Their clothing goes into bags here, get into a fresh uniform, and then they're back out on the road. That hazmat scene that I mentioned briefly, I ordered the officers that were there ahead of me to leave the scene and immediately go back here and decontaminate even before I got to the scene myself.
Do Vic PD officers wear body cams? And this was asked specifically to that case you presented where the gun got moved. And I guess it's asked in terms of helping to document a scene to avoid confusion.
We don't yet, I'll say yet, wear body cameras. We did a pilot project with them a couple of years ago. Actually, most officers, myself included, I would actually love to have a body camera system. I think it would be great evidence. It would be great evidentiary value for what we're doing. I would have no concerns. The same idea like I gave you. Somebody standing outside of the crime scene videotaping me, couldn't care less. It won't impact me. But we don't have them, and we don't have the, to be blunt, I don't believe we have the money to implement them at this time.
All right. What level of first aid training do police officers have?
That's an interesting one. At times, depending on when they're going through their career, almost little to none at various times. We're CPR qualified. We do an annual refresher right now on that. Emergency first responder, first aid. We have at various times done that as well, but it's one we've got so many different training aspects, legal studies, use of force, firearms, that at times our first aid training falls off the corner of the desk. We're not qualified for periods of time at all.
All right. Someone wants to know how you collect samples of dried blood, and can you get DNA evidence from blood that has dried?
From DNA from blood, absolutely. If it's dried, we prefer it to be a dried sample once it's locked into a piece of evidence, a dried sample on a shirt sleeve, say. What we'll end up doing, if it's something that we're not going to necessarily keep the article and send the article to the DNA lab, we'll just do a wet swab onto the material, swab off a portion, and send that swab in for DNA analysis. If it was a dried sample on a floor, I would cut out a piece of the flooring. I would do a scrape. We can do, usually though, a wet swab technique. We're just using a saline solution on a sterile swab or a capture type swab.
All right. What are the initial tests that are done on scene to determine whether a substance is blood?
Now we'll generally use phenolphthalein. Phenolphthalein is a 3-part liquid that we'll do, and then we're looking for the reaction to tell us that it's actually blood. We used to use hemosticks. One of the problems with hemastick is initially we would actually touch a moistened hemastick to a blood droplet. If we then swab that droplet and send it off to the lab for DNA analysis, that actually, it doesn't alter the DNA, but it masks it for one of the tests that the DNA lab does. So the DNA lab itself couldn't locate it anymore. So we do it, it's called a double swabbing technique. I'll swab a suspected droplet from an article from a floor. I'll test that swab with a hemastick stick, check to see if I get a reaction for blood, and then I'll also swab it for one piece. That will be the evidence DNA swab. One of the things that we find though is we do get false positives with hemastick. We don't tend to get them with phenolphthalein. And also, if it's a droplet that I'm collecting a series, like a blood trail, I'll collect a number of them throughout the course of the trail. So if I collect some that are not actually blood, it's not what I'm looking for are the ones that are, and those will go off. Perhaps I'll send off 5 or 10 different swabs to the lab.
Nick has a multi-part question for you.
Uh-oh.
How long does it take for an autopsy to be conducted? Do remains need to be sent elsewhere? Do you have a designated physician or pathologist on call?
Interesting series of them. This has gone in about 17 different circles during the time that I've been doing this. When I started in forensics, we would do forensic autopsies here in Victoria. There was a local pathologist that was a board certified, or I should say was a forensic pathologist, and they would do them here locally. That's actually something that's completely under the control of the BC Coroner Service. We can't order, we the police can't order a forensic autopsy. What we end up doing is we tell and work hand in hand with the Coroner Service and say, we've got concerns about this investigation. We are asking for a forensic autopsy to be done, and the BC Coroner Service agrees or disagrees. And if they disagree with it, then we've got a challenge, and we have to, I guess in a way, move up the food chain and have arguments at higher and higher rank levels as to why we are asking for a forensic autopsy. And that does happen on occasion because they need to justify why a forensic autopsy is going to take place. More recently, all forensic autopsies were done in the Lower Mainland. There was only 2 facilities, either Vancouver General or Royal Columbian, that they would do all forensic autopsies. Over the course of the last few years, they've gotten so busy in the Lower Mainland, they won't do any for us on the island. And we actually had to go to Kelowna, Penticton, or Kamloops to have a pathologist in one of those regions conduct the forensic autopsy. Because a forensic autopsy is not the same as a regular pathological examination. It has to be what's supposed to be a board certified forensic autopsy doctor doing them. Now, we've just switched back that they're being done here in Victoria again, but still we have to justify it to the coroner service, and they have to make all arrangements. We do attend, like either a detective along with the forensic officer, or we may have a couple of members from our investigative team go to the autopsy, and we're there taking photographs for the pathologist, and we're also collecting evidence.
Following up on that, somebody else asks, what are circumstances where autopsies may not be required?
Different arguments. If the cause of death and the mechanism is so visible that it's obvious, I shouldn't speak for the coroner service, but I think in their viewpoint is it's so obvious that it was a gunshot injury, we don't need to conduct an autopsy. Our argument, though, is that I have to take all of this into court. I'm not qualified to go in and say the cause and mechanism of death was a 9mm gunshot wound to this portion of the victim's body, and then they bled to death. I can't say that. I can say a lot of things in court. I can't say that. The coroner wouldn't get called to court and say that. So that's why we ask for a pathologist to be the one to say that in court. But the coroner service, their argument would be, but it's so obvious that it was a death caused by a gunshot. So we get into these circular arguments as to, do we need one? Well, from a legal standpoint, absolutely, we need one. And that's why we put pressure on the coroner service, and they're the ones, though, that have to manage their books and say how many autopsies they can authorize. And that's outside. I can't comment on how they sort of assess and what they do for that.
All right. Next question is another one from Nick. He's asking, following a resuscitation, paramedics often pick up garbage and detritus left from our resuscitations, things like packaging from our equipment or supplies. Is this helpful or detrimental to you?
My go-to answer would be leave everything in situ. I don't want anything inadvertently to be collected that could be actually somebody else was there before you guys got there, before somebody took life-saving efforts. Somebody else had a bandage and applied some form of first aid. So our training would be leave everything in situ. We do know when we get to a scene, and it's obvious when it's medical gear, it's clean, it's unused, otherwise it's all around where the body was known to be. But it's the same argument with like intubation tubes or anything like those. We don't have them removed from a deceased victim before the person goes to autopsy. They're actually left right in situ, right through to a pathologist. They can remove them, and they want to see what was in place, even if it's to the point of emergency room equipment that can still be transported, not the most expensive equipment, of course, but I mean, any of the consumables are still left attached to the person.
Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of questions kind of asking similar along the lines of what can first responders do to minimize our impact on scene? If we're in a possible crime scene, how do you want first responders to go about that scene?
Yep.
Is there anything we can do to make the lives of the police a little bit easier?
Save their life. So one of the things for us really is your job is of such absolute importance for the life saving, is that is first and foremost. Everything else is secondary at that point. Even though we would love to come into a pristine scene, everything is geared to life saving if at all possible. Once that is no longer possible, or once the life has been declared to be ended, at that point it's determining, what have I done, what have I moved, what mental notations can I make, and then what can go in my report as to what did I see, what did I move, now that the person has been declared to be deceased. One example that came up here was the event that called us to a building at one point, this is a number of years ago, was a fictitious event by the attacker. So he had staged what had taken place. The victim was almost like in a positional asphyxia position, face down inside a very soft couch. It was a real troubling, problematic scene. The living victim, I'll use air quotes on the victim, said that the deceased was the attacker. So everything, though, that was done was towards this male that was face down on this soft couch. Everything had to be moved. It was a very small area. It was a very, very tight area. Everything had to be moved to try to get a place to do life-saving efforts on that person. He was ultimately declared to be dead. What ended up being a real problem, though, was nobody could really accurately recall the initial position of the two males inside on arrival. When everybody went in and sort of stepped back at the end of the life-saving efforts and said, well, wait a minute, where was the so-called victim who had been the one to call 911? Where was the guy that ultimately was deceased? He was the one face down on the couch. Nobody could really accurately recall that until quite some time later. So a lot of the comments on the investigation were transposed as to who was where, what couch was in what position. So the whole thing is, yes, your primary job is to save life. If that's impossible, your next step should be to mentally note, what did I see? What did I move? Where can I document that? And I'm not telling you what your reports look like or don't look like, but how is that information going to make its way to me as the investigator? Because it may be critical. In that one, that example, without going into a ton more detail on it, the body position and our wrong anticipation or wrong belief of where the body was positioned, it sent us off on a whole bunch of different trails for it. And ultimately, it was a really troubling, difficult investigation until we finally got back at sort of in full circle to one of the attending people that had a very clear recollection of position, a very clear idea of where everybody, the two guys, were placed inside that suite, and it was accurate in the end.
All right. Do you have any pet peeves that paramedics or firefighters often do that you would like us to stop doing?
Paramedics, absolutely not. I don't actually. Firefighters, it's a different mindset. It is a different mindset from mine. We do joke, I'll be honest, we do joke a little bit about the evidence destruction unit. That's just in full frank disclosure here. The example I give, like their mindset is also in a bloodletting scene, trying to shield a person at a store. And so when they went in to try mitigate the scene, it was destroying all the evidence that I needed. So there was a lot of application of cleaners, a lot of material being washed down the sidewalk, which would have been fine after the scene and after the investigation, but not at the front end. So that was, and I don't blame them too much because their mindset was not that any of this was evidence. They're not trained to look for evidence. Their mindset is not to collect that evidence. It was to help assist the poor kid at the gas station that had blood all over the place. So that's just one example of it.
Andrew's asking, how do you balance cleaning or exposing a wound and preserving evidence, like in the cases of a physical attack or suspected sexual assault or rape?
Okay.
Well, we don't at my end. Of course, we don't. The balance is not really done. What we'll end up doing is if we're with the victim, our mindset right from the get-go, ours is in police in general. Life-saving efforts, preserving the person, trying to mitigate the injury. But at that point, that's more important. And then it's collecting everything after the fact. So if a living victim is transported up to hospital, what we'll try to do is get there as soon as possible. We will try to collect evidence without disrupting the life-saving efforts, or try, if they're urgent enough that they have to take priority, they're urgent enough and they take priority. We'll do collection of material afterwards. I'm not going to stop a doctor from doing surgery or ambulance attendants from trying to save somebody's life, but we will do it, and we'll try to swab, we'll try to photograph, we'll try to do those things without interrupting the preservation of life. If it means swabbing material quickly, that may be a case. That may be something like if it's a bite, a human bite on an exposed skin area, we may try to get a swab done quickly of that area before the wound is cleaned. May not be possible.
The next question is, what is the actual fiscal cost of DNA testing?
It really depends. There's two different ways that we go about DNA testing. DNA testing is not done by a police department. It's always done by either the RCMP for most provinces and most police agencies, or by the two provinces with a provincial lab are Quebec and Ontario. They have a province-run forensic lab. The rest of the country, we use the RCMP lab facilities across Canada. And we pay in the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be a member of that team and use their resources. So what we'll do though is, like if I have an investigation, I will send in a detailed report to the lab. They approve what swabs or what exhibits they will examine, a lot less than you may think. I maybe will get as many as 8 exhibits into the lab, likely a lot less than that. And they will also tell me how long it's going to take to examine. I don't have any control over that. If I choose to go outside to a private lab, a single swab to develop into a DNA profile at a commercially available lab in Canada will cost me somewhere in the region of $200 to $500 for one swab to generate a profile. The problem with that is, what do I do with it then? What do I compare it to? If I get it done at a private lab, I'm not allowed to compare that profile to the DNA data bank in Canada. I have to use the RCMP system to compare it to the national DNA database.
All right, question from Nicole. She's asking, do investigative teams travel to other cities to assist or take a case from the local investigative team? And if so, in what kind of cases would that occur?
It happens more often than people might think. If it's a homicide on Vancouver Island, There is an integrated homicide unit called VIMQ, the Vancouver Island Integrated Major Crime Unit. VIMQ investigates all murders on Vancouver Island with a couple of exceptions. I was a member of VIMQ for 5 years. We would travel anywhere that there was a homicide, and we would use the local forensic resources. So if it was in Port Hardy, I'd use the RCMP. If it was here in Victoria, we would use the Victoria forensic officers to investigate. But the actual command of the investigative unit is done by that integrated unit. And that's fairly similar to the Lower Mainland. IHIT, I'm sure most people have heard of IHIT, the Integrated Homicide Unit, and they travel all over the Lower Mainland investigating homicides all throughout the Fraser Valley. But there's still, like, Vancouver operates its own homicide unit. If the primary offense took place in my jurisdiction, even if a minor portion of it took place elsewhere, that may draw me to that other location, so that I will go up somewhere outside of Victoria and seize evidence. I might go up to another location and process a stolen car that relates to my primary investigation from Victoria. And that happens quite often.
Kyra's asking if a paramedic is working on or treating an injured suspect, at what point can they be arrested?
We'd have to find out how injured are they. If they're injured to the point of life-saving efforts, that's going to carry on. So I'm not going to interrupt life-saving efforts to make an arrest. If the person has been deemed a danger to themselves or others under the Mental Health Act, I'm not going to take custody of them away from the medical system, because obviously they need the medical system first and foremost. We would then work with the medical system to say, at what point do you think he or she is going to be released? Are they safe to be released? Are they medically stable? We would make those inquiries afterwards. But if the person just needs emergency care for an injury, we'll let that take place. We'll accompany them. We may end up having them in our custody, but medical activities still taking place. It really depends on the danger level as well. If you and your staff or the hospital staff are being put at risk because we're transporting somebody that needs care but is a danger, we would have to be there to mitigate that danger. But the medical side would still have to take place. The wound would have to be cared for.
All right, there's a question. Is fentanyl prevalence affecting crime scene management in any way?
Huge. How's that for a simple answer? Yeah, we went through an initial phase of, I won't call it paranoia, but almost paranoia that every powder substance was fentanyl. And there was a lot of discussion in the forensic side, anecdotal evidence of an incident that a body had been fingerprinted. It was an overdose with fentanyl. And then the paper that the fingerprints were on were contacted by a member who then got a fentanyl overdose. It was almost a massive exaggeration of the actual risk to some degree. But what it's done now, it's settled into a logical assessment. We assess any drug product in Victoria, and we anticipate that the likelihood is fairly high it will contain fentanyl. It's our testing anyway with our devices have shown that to be accurate. So any of the powder substances that we find likely have fentanyl. It's made it more difficult for us to process some evidence for DNA and fingerprints that are packaging for drug material. So we do less of them, and we do them in a more methodical, protected manner. We don't transport them throughout the building. We transport them in sealed containers. And we have that discussion when we first were going to a lot of these overdoses and things. We actually would overtly position Narcan kits. So if I went to an overdose, I would actually tell the scene officers that were there, my Narcan kit's here. I'm going to leave the door unlocked. I'm in here by myself. Make sure you watch me when I come out. So we kind of put each other on notice. that's lessened a slight bit, but all of my vehicles, all of my staff, we have Narcan kits everywhere. We carry them with us more often, and we anticipate that that's what we're going to see. Knock on wood, none of us have ever had an accidental overdose of any sort, and we contact material that likely has had fentanyl touching it or on it quite regularly.
Can non-police first responders take photos for evidence, i.e. instead of mental notes?
I guess the quick answer would be yes. However, there's always a however. I would caution what device you're going to take a photograph on. Our officers are all, I'm talking just general police in Victoria, we're all issued with work cell phones. A lot of guys also carry their own personal cell phone. So the ready go-to camera on their own personal phone, I asked them, would you like me to go through everything on your phone in court? And they're like, well, no, it's my privacy. It's my banking information. It's my emails. It's my text messages. And I say, no, so don't take anything on your personal device. Don't take photographs on a personal device unless you want us to have to ask to gain access to everything on your device to download those images. If it's a work phone, I say yes. If there's a way for you to transfer it and secure it, that photograph may become key evidence. So how is it preserved? Did you attach it to an email, or did your phone get downloaded at your station? Is there a process? If it's your own phone, I'd be very cautious about using your own device to take in something that ultimately would be evidence.
Yeah, I can briefly touch on the ambulance side to that question. I was always told to just leave my personal phone alone and to take photos with the laptops that we use to document our PCRs, because it's a whole lot easier to give that away than your own personal phone. So
absolutely, I'd 100% agree.
If I can jump in there, Anna, really fast, just
yeah.
as I sit in a darkened room here at work, just as a quick note for the folks, because we do have a lot of people who work for the BC Ambulance Service as well. Or this is obviously is not a BC Ambulance presentation tonight, but a lot of the members of the audience are employees here. We do actually have really specific policies that dictate under what circumstances we can take photos with those laptops, and we do have to actually ask a patient's permission now before we can take photos with those laptops. We're not allowed to just take photos willy-nilly without actually getting explicit permission to do that. There's a lot of patient privacy and confidentiality stuff that comes into play for us that is not in play for the police, or is in play for in a different way. I just want to give everyone a quick reminder about that as well, that it's not like we can just start snapping photos without or indiscriminately without talking to someone about that, especially in their residence or whatever. And I did see a note here as well reminding us about patient privacy. Privacy stuff, again, if you're working for an ambulance service or an emergency service agency that has access to that kind of technology to do scene photos or whatever, you should probably have an awareness of the privacy implications as well. And I see one person that says the St. John Ambulance has photos or has policies around photos as well. And you're correct, we do. There's a lot of anything in the EMS world, anything that's identifiable, and that could even be a distinctive type of runner or shoe or a distinctive sock or tattoo or something that might become public and could be used to identify that person publicly would likely be regarded as a breach of confidentiality. It needs to be handled very, very sensitively and very delicately. So, everyone's going to have their own policies from their agencies that they're working for and representing, but I just like to make sure everyone's reminded of that. I'll be quiet now.
Thanks, Nick. That was a good, thorough explanation of it. Somebody's asking about the impacts of COVID on policing. How has COVID affected policing, not just police work, but staffing due to exposure or illness?
It's had quite a significant impact. Just speaking for my unit itself, we basically we work in one facility at Vic PD headquarters. There's a fairly good number of us out of one office. During the initial phase, we minimized staff here present at the building. We tried to maximize distancing. We would also have to use a lot more of our PPE. We're quite well versed in PPE, and we're used to dealing with potential contaminants. So we just increased all of our practices. We increased all of our amount of collected PPE and training that we provided to our frontline officers. So we still had to maintain, though, a 24/7 on-call person to attend scenes of crime. We were just masking up a lot more, cleaning a lot more, and minimizing the number of us that were physically here at our office. We've reverted back now to a little bit, not looser, but there's more staff present here. Within our facility as a whole in Victoria, we've maintained a lot more physical distance, a lot more restrictive distancing, and that all of our offices and space are marked as to how many can be in any one area at any given time. And our cleaning protocols have gone up through the roof. Unfortunately, we still have a contact issue. We're still contacting with challenging clients, same sort of challenging clients that any first responder has to deal with. We're very lucky, actually, that our street entrenched population, knock on wood, has not seen some sort of massive response or massive outbreak.
Mm-hmm. Someone's just asking for clarification on the topic of photos. If someone takes photos with their personal device, sending that image to the police would not be sufficient. We would need to surrender our personal phone.
No, I wouldn't agree with that 100%, but it's possible. If somebody came to me and said, I took a photograph of that, any person says, I took an evidence photograph of that, whatever that might be. If there's a method for them to safely transmit it to me by email as an attachment, that may be sufficient. If it's really critical in the investigation, I may have to get basically to understand the original, like where is the original held? What's the original of a digital image? Is there any way that you as the author of that photograph could have altered it? That's where the whole thing that I may need access, and do I have the right to seize your phone, or do I have the ability to just ask you for it? And it really depends on the scenario. If you're not an accused person in any way, if you're a bystander, if you say, no, I'm not giving you the phone, well, do I have the right, and this may be an argument, I may have the ability to seize the device and then apply for a warrant, because I don't have your permission anymore, a warrant to go in and get it. If the photo is simply just one of a general scene, the likelihood is no, you send it, attach it to an email, send it to me, I'll give you my card, it's got my email address on it, and that's it, that's sufficient. I think the risk of it at the end, if that's why I don't take anything on my personal phone, even though I have it with me. I don't take anything on my personal phone at all.
Right. Those are all the questions that I've seen. If I've missed anybody's question, please send it to me again or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
Actually, I have a question, and it has to do with the photos. If it goes to an SD card, and from St. John's point of view, for the responder, and it's treated like a PCR, why couldn't that be used?
So the image itself is been saved to your SD card, and then you would be handing over the SD card to me. Is that what you're meaning?
Correct.
Yeah, that likely would meet that need as well. If there's nothing else, if it's just simply 1, 2, 3 photographs that you took that met your requirements for privacy, like we were discussing earlier, and it's saved on the SD card, You handing that SD card to me, I can transmit it further from there and save it to my investigation. It would come up as a question then afterwards. The whole thing, the potential for it is there any alteration that could have been done? And this is a defense type issue. Is there anything possible that could have been done in you saving it to me showing it in court? Generally speaking, I wouldn't be the one showing it in court. You'd be showing it because you'd be called as the author of that photograph.
The reason why I ask is I have a learning disability, so writing things on the fly for me is difficult. So I do use photos and voice to text quite a bit.
Yeah, if you're saving them, if that's the method that we use, the same basically. My camera, thankfully, is my memory as well, because we take photographs of a warrant that's given to me. I take photographs of the doorknob with the key in it to show when I entered. We use that photograph as our notes. So it's an interesting argument. Just the difficulty that I have still is sort of a general sense is personal items or personal items versus company equipment. Company equipment is preferable.
All right, keep your questions coming if you have them. We'll stick around for a little bit longer.
I feel the same way. I'm just gonna unmute myself here. I'm actually still at work. I didn't have time to get home before Jonathan's presentation starts. So I'm gonna leave you guys and say goodnight now. But I just want to take a moment to thank Jonathan very much for the time and effort to put this presentation together for us tonight. This is genuinely a really, really useful and helpful window for a lot of us into your world. And to help us understand what another allied public safety agency is doing and how you're interacting with content, with scene, with evidentiary issues, with all this other stuff that we interact with but really don't have nearly as good an impression or understanding of as you do. And it's really helpful for us to be able to hear how you're handling all that. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us tonight. It's really, really appreciated. I'll drop you an email later tonight or tomorrow, Jonathan, just to verify that everything here is okay to publish online and all that sort of stuff, and all that. So you've still got a chance to take back anything. Your comments about the fire department notwithstanding, those are going public, buddy. But yeah, thank you so much again, and I wish everyone a good evening. Oh, and pardon me for we don't have the slides up right now because I forgot to send them to Jonathan. But do remember that if anyone wants to join us for future presentations, please don't hesitate to look us up on YouTube for our previous recordings. Just search SJA Vic BC on YouTube, or if you'd like to join us live in coming weeks, email Anna at astefek, ASTEFEK @div176.ca, and we'd love to make sure you're added to the list to join us every Monday. I'll let Anna explain the rest of that later. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you again, Jonathan, for a fantastic talk, and have a good night.
You're very welcome. I did notice there was a quick question from a military aspect. I'll give a real quick answer to that if the person's still here. It was a question on crime scenes on a military establishment. The military owns their establishments. They are the primary agency. We have been asked to come in, just based on our training and experience, to come in and process scenes for them, but very few and very far between. Generally speaking, they would call out their own investigators to their own scenes. The ones that come to mind are they had DNA aspects for it or body recovery, and we had a little bit more hands-on training in different scenarios to offer them. We just did the scene for them and handed all of our findings to the unit, to the military.
All right, if you look in the chat, there's a bunch of people saying thank you for the presentation. We appreciate you taking time out of your evening to talk to all of us. We had about 50 members at one point from all over the province and some in Ontario, so good turnout.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. That was great.
And thank you very much from Ontario, actually.
Have a good night, folks.
All right. It looks
Good
like
night.
we're leaving, so we'll kind of wind things down, and everybody stay tuned for next week's invitations and for videos that get posted on our YouTube channel.